Hello there. Today I'm taking a look at a wine from Kumeu River, and I'm very fortunate to say that this is the first of 5 of their Chardonnays from the newly released 2025 vintage that I'll be looking at. So the one I'm starting with is their Rays Road Chardonnay, and this stands out from amongst their range as being the one wine that doesn't actually come from Kumeu, which is where they're based. This instead, the Rays Road Vineyard, is in Hawkesbay, which is on the east coast of New Zealand's North Island. Now, the wines are produced by the Brajkovich family. They're a family whose grandparents came to New Zealand just before the Second World War. And like many immigrants to New Zealand from Dalmatia, initially, I believe, worked very hard in the gum fields until they were able to afford a property, which they bought in Kumeu in 1943. This was Mick, Kate, and their son Matty. And it was largely Matty who was responsible for building up the winery that was known as San Marino. But in 1990, he decided to take the vineyard in a different direction. He felt that the future of New Zealand's wines wasn't in producing wines from hybrid grape varieties, which most producers were doing at that stage. He instead wanted to focus on high quality Vitis vinifera grape varieties. As a result, they started planting Chardonnay. Today, they have some of the oldest plantings of the quality Mendoza clone anywhere in New Zealand. Now, the vineyard at Rays Road in Hawke's Bay was actually established in 2008. It was a joint venture between the Trinity Hill Winery and a French producer from the Loire, from Sancerre, Pascal Jolivet. And the vineyard comprises somewhere in the region of 30 hectares of vines. Now, somewhat frustrated by the inability to expand their vineyard holdings in the Kumeu area, the Brajkovich family decided to purchase the Rays Road Vineyard in Hawke's Bay in 2017 to enable their operation to continue expanding. Since purchase, they've pulled out most of the Sauvignon Blanc. I believe the last of it went actually in 2025, although I do believe that a failure of the contract to sell the last of the fruit actually meant that they made a Sauvignon Blanc in 2025. They've also been looking at improving the clones of the vines planted at Rays Road, particularly the Chardonnay, where the clone planted had been clone 95. And the replanting that the Brajkovich family have done has utilised clone 15, clone 548, and I believe also more recently a little more of the Mendoza clone, with the idea that these different Chardonnay clones actually give a much deeper, broader and more nuanced expression of Chardonnay. Evidently, the vines that they still have that were the original clone 95 plantings are now only used to produce their entry-level Kumeu Village Chardonnay. One of their first improvements at the vineyard, however, was to pull out the irrigation, which will of course reduce yields, but results in fruit with much more concentrated flavours. Now, the vineyard at Rays Road is quite unusual for Hawke's Bay. It's further inland than most of the vineyards there, and is at a higher altitude at somewhere in the region of 180 metres above sea level. It's described as being a limestone hillside, and these limestone hillsides actually cover quite a large area in this part of New Zealand's North Island. The vineyard has a northerly aspect, which of course in the southern hemisphere means it's facing the sun, and these days, as I say, it's completely dry farmed. One of the things about the limestone soils here is it gives quite a stark contrast to the style of wines that are actually produced in Kumeu, where here in West Auckland we tend to have quite heavy clay soils, which can result in wines with a fuller bodied style. Just to put the contribution of Rays Road to Kumeu River's enterprises into context, I note that in 2025 they took 200 tonnes of fruit from Hawke's Bay, whereas they harvested 300 tonnes from Kumeu. So this is becoming an increasingly quite important part of their production. And in 2025, as well as producing Chardonnay in their own vineyards for their Kumeu River range of wines, they actually bought Chardonnay grapes from vineyards on the Bridge Par. Now, 2025 turned out to be a remarkably dry season, with it being dry pretty much throughout the whole of the harvest. The growing season overall was excellent. As well as being dry, there were very few extremes of heat. I think there were 2 days throughout the year when temperatures exceeded 28 degrees Celsius. One of those was in December and another closer to harvest in February. And this steady warmth was ideal for the slow development of flavours in the fruit. So with dry conditions and fairly moderate yields, they've ended up with some really quite rich textures in the Chardonnay. And the Brajkovich family rate the 2025 vintage as outstanding. They also note that after 2 consecutive small vintages, it was nice to have a normal volume of wine produced again. So following on from 2024, where some vineyards, Coddington for instance, I think production was down 40% in 2024, 2025 sees that back at the usual levels. As far as winemaking is concerned, the fruit is all hand-picked. It's then trucked in refrigerated bins up to the winery in Kumeu for processing there. The approach at Kumeu River is to use whole bunch fermentation, and the fermentations are all allowed to start with the ambient yeasts that come into the winery on the fruit. Fermentation goes on in French oak barrels. They're using 228 litre Burgundy PS barrels. And for the Rays Road Chardonnay, there was no use of new oak, so these were all seasoned oak barrels. The wine underwent malolactic conversion. It was aged with its lees, and they left the wine with full solids, with those being stirred up occasionally to keep them in suspension, pretty much through until the wine was bottled in May 2026. So let's take a look at it, shall we? The wine's colour is relatively pale, greenish yellow, translucent and beautifully catching the light here of the evening sun. So let's see what we make of the aromas, shall we? Initially, the aromas are really quite saline, they're pungent, and as you look at them further, you start to see notes of lime flower just edging in there. And then as the aromas open up, you get some creamy hints, and behind that, some peachy fruit. So let's have a taste, shall we? On the palate, as with the nose, the first impression is a salinity. There really are mineral notes, and somehow those combined with some lovely fresh acidity are helping to enhance some cedary vanilla notes on the palate. And that's all nicely combined with some delicate creamy notes. There's a mouth-watering juiciness, and on the finish you see notes of peach. The acidity is fresh, it's giving some nice length, and just at the finish you see some delicate notes of lime flower and that distinct salinity. Now the comparison I make for this wine is back to the 2024 vintage, which actually had much more forward fruit and was more tropical. This is a much more restrained wine, and I think will probably take 2 or 3 years in bottle before its fruit really starts to show through. All the elements in here are beautifully balanced, and there is a lovely rounded midway texture. The alcohol is at 13.5%. More of that maybe giving just a tiny bit of warmth and just helping to show a little bit of oak spice. In honesty, like every other part of the wine, it's beautifully in balance. The flavours last really well, and there is a lovely complexity. I took a look at the Wine Search aggregated critic score, and to be honest, those scores for this wine make no sense to me. There are no scores yet showing for the 2025 vintage, but those that are showing for previous vintages from 2020 onwards are all marked at 92 out of 100. I think this wine exceeds that. I think this is probably a wine that's worth 93 points out of 100. It's a bit more lean and mineral and more classically styled than the richer 2023, which gave an instant hit of tropical fruit. This is a wine that will take a little longer to develop. The Brajkoviches do suggest that their Chardonnays are probably best drunk between 6 and 8 years of age, and certainly I think coming back to this wine in 5 or 6 years' time, I'm sure we'll see a beautifully developed wine that there'll be no hurry to drink up. So thank you so much for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed the tasting. If you have, it would be fantastic if you could press the like button for me. If you're watching my tastings and enjoying those, and particularly if you would like to watch the rest of the tastings I will do for Kumeu River's 2025 Chardonnays, do please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. Signing up costs nothing, and that way you can set yourself an alert and you can be notified every time I publish a new tasting. If you have friends you think might like to watch the video, I'd be really grateful if you'd pass that on to them. That would be fantastic. And if you have any questions or comments, please do pop those in the comments box below. I'd love to hear what you think about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else that relates to that. I will of course leave a link in the notes below to the Wine Searcher webpage for Kumeu River's Rays Road. I'm not sure that there are actually any listings for the 2025 yet, but you will be able to see those there when they become available. I think this has been another very successful vintage for Kumeu River, and I'm looking forward to trying the other wines in this selection. So thank you for your time in watching, and I do hope that maybe you'll come and join me for some of the other videos. Hopefully we'll see you there. Bye for now.